My name's Sarah Lancaster. I'm the industry programmer for this year's festival. And welcome to our third of three, our trilogy of Moguls, if you will. We're absolutely delighted to have both of these gentlemen here today. And I would now like to introduce you to our moderator. Very pleased to have Mike Goodridge, the editor of Screen International, here today to lead today's conversation. So throw to you, Mike.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome everybody today to our Mogul session with Michael Jay Werner, who's the chairman of Fortissimo Films. Fortissimo is 20 years old this year, as you can see from this anniversary book, published by Screen International.
Just came out a few days ago. On sale at newsstands everywhere, right?
Not yet, but we're working on it.
eBay, maybe.
But it's a really interesting read to look through the history of this extraordinary company, and it really has been a company that's broken ground in the world of international sales and finance. It's discovered and promoted a lot of filmmakers that without Fortissimo we really wouldn't have seen, I don't think. So we're going to talk to Michael today about Fortissimo, of course, but we're also going to talk about his career before and during that, which in my mind gives us a good picture of how the independent businesses has evolved over the last 30 years, whatever it is. So let's start by talking about Fortissimo, Michael. Do you want your mic? For those who don't know, give us a brief snapshot of the company.
Well,
today.
Fortissimo is, I think it's in a lot of people's hearts and a lot of people's minds as one of the pioneers of the sales business and the distribution of cinema from places that people have only dreamed about visiting and people have wanted to go see but maybe haven't had the chance. And I think what Fortissimo did when it was started and throughout its 20 years of existence so far has been to bring cinema from all these unusual places and places now that have become part of the mainstream, but places that we've all dreamt about, and has brought cinema from those places to the mainstream universe. And 20 years ago, it's before my time. I wasn't one of the founders of Fortissimo. In fact, one of the founders, Helen Loveridge, is sitting here in the audience, so guilty as charged, yeah. So Helen and my late business partner, Wouter Barendrak, and a Hong Kong journalist named Shuke, were all involved in different facets of the film business. Helen had been in the sales business. Shuke was a journalist. Wouter was in the festival programming business, but festival programming, and had this idea that there were many wonderful films that were coming out and showing up in festivals, but then that's where they stopped. They showed in festivals, and then there was no distribution, and if there was no distribution, then the only people who saw those films were people who went to festivals. And they started Fortissimo, and they started with a few films from these interesting but obscure places at the time, and from that they built this wonderful business.
You're based in Hong Kong personally, but the company has bases in Hong Kong and Amsterdam, rather.
Right. The company was originally founded in Amsterdam. That's the legal domicile, and that's where we do all the legal work, the delivery, the contracting, the administration is done out of there. Sales are done out of London, out of New York, out of the Hong Kong office, and also a little bit out of the Amsterdam office.
Right.
So.
And just to give us a rundown, what are the films that you're representing here at Toronto this year?
We're representing a film that was in competition in Venice from Taiwan called Warriors of the Rainbow, Warriors of the Rainbow Scenic Ballet, which is the largest film ever mounted in Taiwan. It's a $25 million epic that John Woo was involved in producing. It's opened just this past weekend in Taiwan, and they had 430,000 admissions. It's either the #1 or #2 film ever in Taiwan. We have a French-Canadian film, our first French-Canadian film called Wetlands, that was in Venice in Critics Week and was the opening film of Canada First, that section that celebrates young Canadian filmmakers. We have a film from Vietnam called Lost in Paradise, which is the first gay positive film from Vietnam. We have a film that we announced today that we picked up called Michael. It's an Indian film that had its world premiere this morning, and had its press and industry premiere and have its world premiere tomorrow night. And we have an Iranian film called Goodbye, a very powerful film by Mohammad Rasulov, who was here, actually was allowed to come to Canada. That film premiered in Cannes this year, and he wasn't allowed to leave Iran, but he was allowed to come to Canada, and he was here for a few days and had a great time. And the film had a good reception. So we have 5 films here.
And that gives you a picture of how eclectic the company is. Films from all over the world, different sizes of films. Let's just trace your personal history back a little bit, because you're a California native, aren't you?
Correct. I was born in Los Angeles.
And sorry.
Go ahead.
And you got into the business, in typical LA style.
The sort of almost nepotism. Not my family, but my best friend when I was growing up. His uncle was a guy named Samuel Arkoff, who was Canadian, I think from Winnipeg. And he started a company called AIP, or American International Pictures. And that was the company that did all those beach blanket bingo and all the exploitation pictures. Roger Corman started out, many people started out there. And when I graduated high school, my friend Greg was working for the company, and he was going to be going away to university, and I was staying to go to UCLA. And I said, oh, Greg, could you ask your cousin? Cousin is a guy named Lou Arkoff, who became a producer. And could you ask your cousin if I could have your job? And he said, yeah, let me ask. And then I got his job. When he went away to school, I started working in the mailroom. And he hadn't worked there long enough. So he was only there about 2 months during the summer after high school. And so I was there for 4 years during university. So after about 3 months, they thought I was the nephew. They all forgot what he looked like, and they thought I was Sam Arkoff's nephew. And I was 17, then 18, and I used to drive Sam and Hilda. Hilda was his wife. They had matching Cadillac convertibles, and I used to have to take the car to the car wash whenever I would work 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And from that experience at AIP, and I was studying international relations. I wanted to be a diplomat. I wanted to be a lawyer or diplomat. And I started studying Chinese in 1975. I was at university. So that was quite early, and not many people studying Chinese then, and I was studying Chinese studies. And
what interested you?
No, I just thought, China? Well, because when I was trying to pick a language, you had to specialize in a language, and then from the language you specialized in a region. I was looking at Russian and Japanese and Chinese. And my family's half Russian, and I was talking to my grandmother, and she said, why would you want to study Russian? We struggled so hard to get out of there. so forget about that. And I had some Japanese friends, and they said, Japanese is very formal and has many layers, and to study the characters, it's all these different layers of civility and different kinds of, it's a very complicated language and very rigid social structure built into the language. And then Chinese seemed interesting because Nixon had just gone to China the year before, and I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, and that's why I studied Chinese. But so I was at AIP for those 4 years, and I started to watch how they did their international distribution, and it was kind of fun. And I met some of those people, like Village Roadshow. Some of those companies were very embryonic companies at the time, so I got to see those companies develop, and I thought, well,
you mean the distributors overseas?
Yeah, that independent distribution business was just sort of starting.
It's very young.
And so there's a company in Italy today still in business called Italian International. It's run by a guy named Fulvio Lucisano. And Fulvio was AIP's agent. And so I used to drive him around when he came to LA. So 30 years later, we always meet up and joke about it, because he's now around 80 and I'm around 30-something.
Yeah.
And
whatever you say.
Yeah. And so we have a nice laugh. But I took Sam's car to the car wash every week. And one of those times, unfortunately, the car wash attendant left the door open, and some other car came alongside and took the door off the Cadillac. And you can imagine as an 18 or 19-year-old kid having to call your office saying, I'm really sorry to tell you that I somehow, Mr. Arkoff's car got damaged. And they came down and the car was hanging on the door was hanging on one hinge, and it was pretty embarrassing. Anyway, so from that, I thought, well, I'm going to stay in the film business. And after I graduated from university, I avoided going to law school and business school. Went to live in Taiwan for about a year. And before I went, I contacted all these film companies saying, I'm going to live in Taiwan. And Taiwan had a quota system at that time, very much like China does today. And I said, I'm going to live in Taiwan, and could I represent your films? And this company called Crown International, very famous, another very famous independent company, said, yeah, we hardly, and they were represented by this company called Manson. Yeah. So they convinced Manson International to have me represent their films in Taiwan. So it was.
And that's what you did for that year?
21 and 22 years old, yeah. And then I came back, and then I couldn't get a job in the film industry. So this is how it goes. I couldn't get a job, and I ended up going to work for 6 months for a guy named James Devaney. And Jim Devaney, if any of you remember the Watergate affair in the U.S., you know, of course. So Jim Devaney had done a deal with H.R. Haldeman. H.R. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff and had shot all these 8mm, back in the days of pre-video, had shot all these 8mm movies of the White House and all these different events. And he was assembling a documentary film, and so I was kind of involved in that a little bit. And then somehow he also got involved in Air China, which was, so China had just finished the Cultural Revolution, was sort of coming back into the world. And Jim, maybe because of all these different connections with the White House, ended up representing Air China for their in-flight magazine sales. So China, movie, everything was sort of all connected together. Yeah. Anyway, then I ended up getting a job at Manson. And I was head of sales at Manson for 8 years. And Manson was one of the pioneers of independent film sales. Yeah,
and you were selling American movies?
Selling American movies. Actually, we sold Scanners, if you remember David Cronenberg's Scanners. That was one of our big films.
So talk about the business then, because it was fueled by video, wasn't it?
Didn't exist yet.
Really?
Yeah. So that's an interesting story, and it actually is a lesson I still kind of work from today. So I started working in June 1980, and immediately I was sent on a sales trip to Asia. So this was a great job. I was 23. I was sent on a 6-week trip to Asia, 10 countries, because Manson, that company, Manson International, hadn't had a salesperson do that kind of sales trip for a long time. So I started in Japan, and it's all scheduled all the way down to New Zealand. And that time you had to carry U-matic tapes. So this is pre-VHS, pre-beta, the big, U-matic tapes that you had to put in the big machines. And you'd have a suitcase full of those with your clothes, a little bit of clothes covering it. And you were supposed to declare those, because most countries, they were illegal to bring in and out. You had to have a bond, you had to have, so sometimes you get caught, and then you had to be like this innocent kid saying, I didn't know, and, I remember when I was in the Philippines, I was sent to meet the collector. I was coming into Manila and going through customs, and they said, what are all these tapes? I said, well, they're just like tapes. So, well, you have to go meet the collector. So I had to pay $200 to get into the Philippines with all these tapes.
And did you go into China?
No, this is but Manson actually was one of the first companies to sell a movie to China. I did that. We sold a Canadian movie, actually, produced by HBO called The Terry Fox Story. So maybe some of you have seen that. It's a story of this Canadian kid who lost his leg to cancer, and then they started this run, and eventually lost his life, and they started this annual run. So that was sold to China for $15,000 in 1983 or 1984.
So you were around at the birth of the American film market, basically.
I've been to every single American film market since 1981.
At the sort of explosion of international sales. I mean, how has it changed since the 80s?
Yeah. Okay, so if you think about Manson had a library, about 300 films. And so then this thing called video started, this video market, or video business. In the old days, there was this battle between VHS tapes and beta tapes. And so some stores, some distributors would only do one, some would do both. But eventually VHS won that battle. But I remember we had the first company we sold to in Scandinavia was a company called Hem Video. And then later in the UK, we sold to a company called VPD. And those were the two pioneers in their countries. And in the first year when we were selling rights, we were licensing those rights for $500 a title, okay? Or $1,000 a title. And then 2 years later, in each of those countries, the market had exploded. And then those rights were worth $20,000 a title. And then maybe a year later, 2 years later, those rights would have been worth $100,000 a title. But because you had sold them early, you had only gotten 500 or 1,000 or whatever, and you couldn't go back and resell them again because they'd already been exposed. And every distributor only wanted new films. They didn't want what had already been released. So I take that lesson even today when thinking about the VOD market or the internet market and how we at Fortissimo approach those markets, because we're not rushing to license our films to those new revenue streams for exactly that reason. So.
But video changed everything, didn't it? You could finance a film in 100% through foreign pre-sales.
Video changed everything because it became a backstop for anybody buying multiple rights would then have this backstop called video. So before that, you bought a film, you released it theatrically. If it didn't work, you lost all the money because there was no video, and very unlikely you could sell that film to television.
Yeah.
But because there was no cable TV yet, and pay TV hadn't really started. And then flash forward 10 years, and video was huge. Pay TV had started. There was HBO, Showtime, Cinemax, all these different channels in North America and around the world. There was kind of parallel development. And yeah, absolutely, you could finance a movie from pre-sales. So it kind of just went like this, very sort of sometimes geometric, sometimes exponential growth, but huge growth that we unfortunately don't see anymore.
Yes.
It's gone, gone.
Those are the glory days, weren't they? When money
They were
was
the glory days.
around.
And like when I started, I think there were maybe 20 foreign sales companies, maybe 15, 20, 25 at most. Thanks. And by, I don't know. So if you look at the American film market, I think there were originally 20 member companies in the American Film Marketing Association. Then it went to then they tried to cap it, but it went to 30 or 40. And then it went to 80, and now there's close to 200. So that business, that distribution business, the number of films, everything just kept expanding.
And now it's going back down again.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, changing.
So what happened after Manson?
So after Manson, I have a connection to Canada. I went to work for Garth Dobrinsky at Cineplex Odeon. Cineplex Odeon Films, which they had started the theaters. He was the pioneer of multiplexing, and then they had started a company in Los Angeles called Cineplex Odeon Films. And Garth, is a great showman, and he's a great everything. And they produce movies like Talk Radio, Oliver Stone's Talk Radio, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Madame Suzatska, Purple Rain, the movie about Prince. So it was a great company.
Mr. and Mrs. Bridge.
Mr. and Mrs. Bridge.
Yeah.
Not Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Yeah, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge. So very good company and quite a lot of adventures there. I remember once, it was a public company, and so when you're a public company, everybody who works for that company has to be very, very careful about what you say, right? Because it somehow might affect the stock value. If people make decisions based on what's in the press, the company can get in trouble. And so I was the second guy in the sales company, in the foreign sales company, which was a pretty significant company. And one day, somebody from the press calls, Hy Hollinger, if you remember Hy Hollinger, sort of a classic old guy
from the Hollywood Reporter.
Yeah, he called and said, "Michael, I've learned some news, and it's late in the day, and I can't reach anybody in Toronto. So I really need to know, because we're going to break this story tomorrow, and I need somebody to confirm or deny this story. I said, what's the story? And they told me the story, and I said, well, I mean, it was happening, whatever it was happening. It was out of film. And I made the stupid decision of saying, yes, I think that's correct. And so in the papers the next day, in the Hollywood Reporter the next day, it said, Michael Werner, spokesman for Cineplex Odeon Films, said blah, blah, blah. So immediately, I'd only been there like 6 months, and immediately I get a call from Cineplex's head of corporate publicity, a woman named Linda Friendly, who in that moment wasn't very friendly, and said, you know, we fire people for things like this, and you know, you could be in a lot of trouble, and the company could be in a lot of trouble. And I said, look, I didn't know. And he said he had this information. He was going to run with it. So anyway, you're never supposed to speak to the press.
That explains a lot, Michael.
Yeah, you have to be careful what you say. So Cineplex Odeon, and then...
so you were in the thick of the LA independent business at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And then what did I do?
Summit?
Yeah, well, they were, at some point Cineplex decided to size down that division, and so I had a way to settle out and get out. And then I was offered a chance to be the first head of Summit International, which, if you know now, Summit is one of the leading producer, distributor, sales companies in the world, yeah?
Yeah.
Headed by Patrick Wachsberger and David Garrett and Bob Hayward. So I was hired by, Summit at that time had 3 owners, the late Bernd Eichinger, Andy Vanya, and Arnon Milchan, 3 very important producers. Arnon owns a company called New Regency, which is a big producer now for Fox, and Andy had owned Karolko, which did Rambo and all those kind of movies, and had a company called Synergy, and Bernd was the head of Constantine Film, so pictures like Perfume and Three Musketeers and films like that. So they each had a favorite candidate to run the company. You know, they were setting up this company to be the foreign sales arm for each of them. They each had 3 separate companies, and they each had a favorite candidate. I won't name them because they're all still around. Yeah, but I was Andy's guy, Andy Vanya's guy, and eventually I won because they decided I was the guy without any ego, and the other 2 had really big egos, which they still have today. So.
And between those 3 producers, you don't need any more egos in that company, I don't think.
Exactly. So Summit started, and we had to deal with HBO Films. We had pictures like Ricochet with Denzel Washington, and it was a great company, and started out and just has grown. But at some point, after 4 years, they decided to bring in Patrick Wachsberger. Patrick was a close confidant of Arnon Milchan. And Patrick and I were friends, but after a while I decided it's better to have Patrick as a friend than to work closely together. And so I decided to figure out how to leave, and 20th Century Fox offered me a job in Hong Kong to move to Hong Kong and be the co-head of Asia for the theatrical division.
Why Hong Kong, and why, I mean, had you been displaying an interest in Asia throughout your sales career at this point?
Well, I was already kind of known as a specialist in Asian cinema, and so when we divide up the world, you know, like in most sales companies, you divide up the world. Different salespeople are responsible for different parts of the world, or different kinds of films, or different buyers depending on your history. So I always had Latin America and Asia. I spoke some Spanish and spoke some Chinese, and I usually mixed them up. But anyway, I could get by, and so that's what I was doing. I mean, besides sometimes having the overall responsibility for sales, I was specifically responsible for those areas. And it was time for change, and I knew Fox was restructuring their international operation. And so I met with Jim Giannopoulos, who's an old friend and now the co-chair of the company. And at that time, Julian Levin was running the international division.
Yeah.
Julian now runs what's called the digital initiative for Fox and the other studios. So all these DCP projectors that you see here in Toronto, and some of which work and some of which don't work apparently. Julian is the studio exec that's unified all the studios with a common position about how they finance that and how they interact with the theater owners. So they hired me to move to Asia. They said, "You want this job, and you know you're qualified. We'd like to have you. So I was moved to Hong Kong, and the other half of Asia was given to Paul Hanneman. Paul, who's now the co-head of 20th Century Fox International, and we're still very close friends. Paul was given Tokyo. He was living in Tokyo, and he was given North Asia. I was given China and all of Southeast Asia.
And did you have a remit to work with the Chinese and the Chinese authorities in getting some of those Fox movies in?
Yeah, actually. So that was part of the reason I was hired as well, was to, back in, I don't know what. So, Fox had become part of News Corporation. Rupert Murdoch had bought Fox. And so in Asia, they had a channel, they had a TV system called Star TV. And Star carried the BBC. And the BBC ran, this is like 1992 or 3 or 4. They ran a series of stories on the BBC. The BBC ran a series of stories about China, which were very non-complimentary to the government. And then I think Rupert also said some things. And so basically, somehow the BBC ended up not being on Star any longer. And so everybody, all the different divisions like Fox and everything, we all downplayed the fact that we were part of News Corp at that time. And that's how we sort of got back into China. The studios, Warner Brothers had been the first studio to get a film released in China on what's now called the Revenue Sharing Program. It was Bodyguard, right? Whitney Houston, right, Kevin Costner. And then we were the second, Fox was the second. And we sort of downplayed that we were News Corp. We took it off the business cards and it just said Fox. Because Fox had a long history in China going back to 1920s. And people knew the name, people knew, a lot of the movies had been on TV, like Sound of Music. So I was responsible for rebuilding the Fox business in China. And the first movie we got approved was Speed Part 1. And was a big success. And then what had happened is we developed, actually Warner's, a woman named Ellen Elizoff, who ran Warner Brothers China, had developed this concept of the revenue sharing program. So all the studios adopted that program, and that's the program that still exists today, that says 20 movies a year get imported into China on this box office sharing basis. And then they tried to have a balance between each studio. So each of us tried to have our own special relationships with China Film. And I was Michael, and I spoke Mandarin, and I was, nice guy, no ego, blah, blah, blah. And so we always got more, I think Fox got more films imported into China in the 10 years that I was involved than any other studio. So, including Titanic, which until Transformers was the most successful movie ever in China. Did box office almost $50 million.
I mean, what is it like to navigate a company like China Film? China Film is the public film body, isn't it, in China?
Yeah, it's the.
How has that changed? Is it much more straightforward these days?
Well, at that time, and until a few years ago, it was the only authorized importer-distributor of foreign films. Then, under some pressure from WTO and from the MPA, they set up another company called Huasha, which was like a sister company, but essentially the same parent company. But now, today, you'd like to sell to China Film because that still has or license to China Film, because they have the best access to cinemas, and they have, it's kind of a near monopoly. But private companies exist. Private companies can buy rights, and they have to buy a quota from China Film. So that the business has changed a lot, actually. Big independent films sometimes go in through China Film, and sometimes they're bought independently, released by independent companies. So, for example, we sold, and it's being released in China before it's being released here in Canada, Norwegian Wood, the film from the Murakami novel that was shot by Tran and Hong last year. And that's going to be released in Canada very soon by Mongrel Media. But in China, it's being released, I think, next week or week after.
And how did you get that in? That's through?
It takes what's called guanxi. I mean, we didn't do it. It's the people we sold to had very good connections with the Film Bureau. The Film Bureau is like the censors. That movie had to be censored because there's scenes that are not allowed according to the Chinese regulations. And we got permission of the filmmaker, permission of the distribution company to have those changes made. But it's an interesting process because we thought the film was going to be, now it's September, we thought the film was going to be imported and released in February for Valentine's Day. That was their original plan. So what happened? Well, intervening events. First of all, as you know, Norwegian Wood is a Japanese story. So that film was shown in Venice last year. Then we showed it at the AFM. We sold it at the AFM. Then what happened was there was a breakout of sort of diplomatic dispute between China and Japan. So over these islands called the Diaoyutai Islands. So not Diaoyutai, these small islands anyway. Yeah. And so all of a sudden anything Japanese related was banned or just wasn't being approved. So we had to go through that. And then when the Chinese dissident was selected for the Nobel Peace Prize, a film with Norwegian wood in a Nobel Prize from Norway. Yeah. Somehow it got associated Norway, Norwegian wood, and so we also we had to wait longer. So anyway, now it's being released.
Give us an idea on a film like Avatar, say, which makes $200 million in China. How much of that does Fox see and how much stays with China Film?
Well, under that revenue sharing deal, it caps out at 17.5%. So if you hit the maximum box office points, you can remit 17.5% of the reported box office. So if it was $200 million, it would have been $50 million. Yeah.
So that's all they got.
But I think I think the picture did $500 million.
Oh, it did.
Yeah, or $600 million. So, or $1 billion. It was huge in China. I think China on Avatar was maybe the second largest market in the world. So that's what China has become. For certain films, it's the first. No, not the first, but it's the second or third or fourth largest market in the world. Yeah. But in terms of what comes back to the studios, because of the deal structure, it's capped at the 17.5%. So that's where it goes.
Okay, so let's go back to Fortissimo.
Unfortunately, Avatar doesn't. I wish Fortissimo had an Avatar because
we all wish we had an Avatar.
Yeah, exactly.
When did you first meet Wouter Barendrecht?
Helen was 1990. It was I was representing a Taiwanese company called Longshan, which produced a movie called Wooden Man's Bride. 93, yeah. So 1993 or 1994, right around then. So I was also doing some things like as what they call producer's rep or buyer's rep. And Longshan had made this movie. It was a Chinese, Taiwan, Hong Kong co-production, one of the first ones. And so they said, hey, we've been approached by Longshan said, we've been approached by this company, Fortissimo, and this guy, Wouter, and never heard of the company. We don't know who they are. Can you check it out? So that's how I met Wouter, and right, Helen? I think that's the story. Yeah, I think that's the story. And start to forget some of these things, although not about the car door coming off at the car wash.
Now, Wouter, for anybody who doesn't know, Wouter was a very colourful character. He was Dutch, living in Hong Kong at this point?
No, living in Amsterdam.
When did he move to Hong Kong?
97. Yeah, right when Hong Kong went back to China.
Right.
He moved there at the urging of Wong Kar-wai, who said, you want to handle all these Chinese films and Hong Kong films, you need to be living in the neighborhood. So at that point we were 1997, I think we took on Happy Together. That was sort of our biggest acquisition, sort of most daring acquisition to date. And but I was still a consultant. I was still working for Fox and just sort of advising Helen and Wouter and kind of meddling and that kind of thing.
So he was very welcome. But we have already had Champagne Express and
right.
Wetlands before.
Correct. But we didn't. You guys didn't have to take a significant financial risk on those. And for Happy Together, we were competing with Samsung. So this what happened. So this sort of relates to the video market. A lot of the Korean companies had come into the business through their video arms, and had ended up with these large companies, and they had huge amounts of money at the time, and they still do, and they were putting it in the film business. And so we were, films like we were expecting to be able to go to Kar-wai, and we thought he would say, okay, you can handle the film just like you've handled the other films. And it was, we went to have the meeting, and it was like, well, I've been offered high 6 figures, almost 7 figures for this picture, And, you know, it's kind of hard to resist, and it was kind of hard for us to say, well, you shouldn't take that. So we ended up having to do the same thing. And we didn't have the money. It was like Kevin Costner in Field of Dreams. We said, well, if you acquire it, they will come. And it worked out fine.
And what was the appetite for Chinese films from Asia at that point in the world?
Quite good, actually.
I mean, Wong Kar-wai obviously had just exploded onto the
Kar-wai, but there was also
scene.
Ho Xiaoxian. There were
Zhang Yimou, I suppose.
early Zhang Yimou pictures. So no, there was quite a growing awareness. I mean, in part by companies like Fortissimo and daring programmers, and a lot of the films were. You had a mixture of underground films, so illegal films in China, and legal films. But no, the awareness was beginning to grow. They were beginning to win awards. But we were there at the forefront, or they were there at the forefront. I came in as it began to pick up.
So you decided to partner with Wouter. How did that come about?
Yeah, I used to say, I mean, now I'm beginning to think, I doubt myself, but I used to say that Wouter and Helen had good taste, but not great business sense, and I had good business sense, but not great taste. So I thought it was a great combination of talents and skills, and yeah, I mean, but eventually what I used to say as well, they developed business sense and I developed taste, so it worked out okay.
And, you know, your years at Fortissimo, you know, the world has changed again. China has changed. China has become an extraordinary film power, if you like.
Well, not just China. I mean, actually, we were at the forefront of, let's say, the Thai New Wave, right? So
yeah.
If you remember pictures like Nanak or later Moonrock Transistor or
Tears of the Black
Tiger or Invisible Waves, I mean, that was Fortissimo, and there were no other distributors handling those kind of films at the time, and so we were involved both from like a curating point of view, but finding those filmmakers, finding those producers, sometimes helping put money into those pictures. But it was there. They had done it before I arrived with Filipino cinema, and we were involved with Korean cinema. We were actually at the very beginning of the Korean New Wave, and then what happened in Korea is a lot of local companies came up and became the primary sales companies, and so we sort of left the Korean sales business. We stopped handling Korean films because we couldn't get them. We have a lot of Japanese cinema, but you know, we also, of course, have a lot of films. If you look at our catalog, there's films from South Africa, so we were quite early on with South Africa, or with a lot of Dutch films, or with some Austrian film. You know, the catalog, it's a very broad catalog, plus American cinema. We have the Jim Jarmusch Library, and we have a lot of amazing films.
And obviously much more competition has come into it. A lot of the French companies started to sniff around.
Yes, we don't
Asia.
like those people.
But you had pioneered it, but you,
yeah, but you couldn't have it all. And kind of what I said before is there just started to be more and more film, more and more cinema, more and more films, partially because the wealth in these countries began to grow, and people could raise money for films, and people went to film school, but also there were more sales companies. There began to be more competition, and then festivals. You know, there were more and more film festivals, and each film festival wanted premieres, or wanted more and more film. They wanted to differentiate themselves, so they were chasing films, and so all these things, I think, contributed to more and more films being made, or more and more films being uncovered and discovered and put onto the world stage.
Talk about your relationship with Wong Kar-wai. He's obviously one of the world's great filmmakers, and you in recent years took In the Mood for Love to Cannes and 2046. He's an interesting guy, isn't he? I mean, I remember in Cannes for 2046, I don't think the print arrived until the day of its screening.
Yeah. Well, it came in sort of reel by reel, and then so they had to move. I don't think it had ever happened in Cannes before. They moved the screening date. The official screening date was moved by 1 or 2 days to accommodate the fact that the print hadn't arrived yet. And he had finished shooting. He had finished doing the mix and everything.
Which is unprecedented in Cannes history, or something.
Yeah, they had finished the mix in Bangkok, and then like his wife brought 2 reels to Paris for subtitling, and then his head of business affairs brought 2. So it was like coming in reel by reel, and
then down to the south of France.
Yeah, and then I remember it was a holiday, but he had forgotten his tuxedo, so they were running around trying to figure out if they could get Valentino or somebody to open up, and sell a tuxedo, and it was pretty funny.
And bearing in mind this film had been in production for 4 years already.
Yeah.
It was a long road, a long haul.
Right. Yeah, a few of the latter films were very lengthy production processes. In the Mood for Love and 2046 in particular.
Is that because he can't ever finish?
I'm the wrong guy to ask. No, I think it's he has a very elliptical filmmaking style. You know, I think a lot of times he shoots because he tends to shoot without a script. He has a concept of what he wants to talk about and what he wants to show, but he doesn't really have a script. And then they'll go a certain distance, and then they're assembling the film as they go along, and then sometimes he decides, well, I need to change the focus, or I didn't quite get what I want, or so with that process, you end up with actors ending up on the cutting room floor. You know, sometimes some of the movies he's done have very significant casts from all over Asia, and then some of them find that they were shooting for 3 years, and they were in the movie for 12 seconds. So it's a process, and working with Karwai, I think for the talent and the crew and the sales agent, and it's quite an experience. But the end result is great.
And the buyers, presumably, who never know when they're going to get the movie.
Yeah, they have a rough idea, what decade it's coming in. So the current film he's working on, The Grand Master, which we're involved in selling a few territories, and I think I'm the associate producer, but I'm not quite sure. I'll have to wait until I see the credits. But that's a relatively short production process. That'll be about 2 years, but it's getting done now.
Talk about some of the. I mean, you say you had some of the illegal films. There were some gay and lesbian themed films. I'm thinking East Palace, West Palace, which presumably were illegal. Yeah,
no, actually, East Palace, West Palace, and those films are still banned, but they're quite readily available in China through on the internet or DVD. But we had pictures from Zhang Yuan, who did like Beijing Bastards and East Palace, West Palace, and he's still making movies, and we're still working with him. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, and those films are still, those are banned. And we had Zhang Wen's film, Gui Zilila, Devils on the Doorstep, which I think is probably one of the most important Chinese films ever made. And that was banned and is still banned. But then he was banned for a few years, and then his last film, which was called Let the Bullets Fly, was the most successful Chinese picture ever made. It did 600 million RMB at the box office. That's about $90 million US.
So the Chinese authorities don't look at Fortissimo in a negative way if you're promoting these films?
That's a very interesting question. I think the answer is that there is a black book, and there are black stars. I think Voucher was not allowed to go to a couple parties. Helen, is that right? Do you remember that? Or yeah, I think there were a couple of parties organized at one point. I was allowed to go in because I was Michael from Fox. They never quite they didn't get the association always right, but I think Voucher was not allowed to go to like one party one year, and you're not allowed. It's not that your name's not on the list; you're not allowed. And I now know from friends who are at the Film Bureau or within the Film Bureau that Fortissimo has a kind of, it's like a mixed blessing. On the one hand, I think they're amazed at what Fortissimo did for Chinese cinema, and probably there are people within that organization who are thankful and grateful. But then there are also people who say, look, they've handled all these films which are against China, and they shouldn't be, well thought of.
Talk about some of your other films. Like you've done a lot of American movies. As the company grew throughout the 90s and the 2000s, you went for a bigger scale of film. You started producing and investing more. Was that necessary? Obviously, the competition for Asian cinema was heating up. But do you also have to sort of raise your game in this current climate?
Yeah, I think it's that old business adage, grow or die kind of thing. sorry, you're compelled to, unless you want to stay at a relatively small scale, you need to compete with all these other companies that are coming on stream, and those companies were going into sort of our playing field, you know, and I think we had to really step up to the plate for new kind of cinema, and I think also the business for art house cinema was changing. It was already beginning to start changing. It became harder to sell certain kinds of films to territories that previously you could sell to. The distributors were beginning to need more commercial films, or even with the art house films that they were distributing, they needed films that would perform at a level where they would justify you know, as a company, you can only handle a certain number of films. So you wanted each film to generate a certain amount of box office and have a certain return. And I think as the business became tougher and films didn't generate those kind of returns, then those distributors we used to work with would say, I have to be more selective. You know, I need a certain kind of film that can work at my box office. So it started to change.
But you also, you know, you've had great success with documentaries, for example, Super Size Me, you know.
Yeah, Capturing the Freedmen, we have some great documentaries. Capturing the Freedmen, Super Size Me, Sketches, the documentary on Frank Gehry, Food Inc.,
Shine a Light,
the Martin Scorsese Rolling Stones documentary. Now we're doing, it'll come out next year, the documentary by Kevin MacDonald on Bob Marley, which should be the ultimate Bob Marley film. So we've done quite a lot of documentaries, and we like them, and they went up and they've come down a bit, but they're very interesting, and we keep looking. We had a documentary in Cannes. It was in Sundance, and we picked it up, and then it was in Cannes on Roger Corman, called Corman's World, and it's really, if any of you know Roger Corman's films, or it's really a fun film to watch because it's about the joy of filmmaking, sort of rebel filmmaking. And Roger's this very Stanford educated studying physics, and he ended up being in the filmmaking business and worked for AIP, which is another reason I thought the film was kind of interesting. It's fun. It was in Cannes, and it's going to a lot of festivals.
So for a sales company these days, you've got to have a wide variety of films that.
Yeah, unfortunately, you don't know what's going to work. So what happened in the past is if you took on a film, you were reasonably confident that you could sell in 10 countries, 15 countries, 20 countries, and generate a certain amount of box office. And so you were able to specialize and handle really those kind of films that you knew well and that you liked. And now it's very unpredictable. You know, certain films that you think will sell well sell 5 territories, and other films that you're not sure about end up selling to the whole world, like Winter's Bone. I don't know how many of you saw Winter's Bone, but quite a lot of you probably. Yeah, it was very successful. I saw that film. It's an interesting story because you learn a lot of things after the fact. So Winter's Bone premiered in Sundance last year, and I saw the film, and I immediately thought, this is a great film, we need to acquire this. And it's exactly the kind of film that we normally don't acquire. It's what I call quirky Americana, you know, sort of backwoods, dusty, dirty, sort of non-aspirational. So you go to other parts of the world and you say, would you like to see this film about dirty, dusty, you know, people living in hovels, and nobody really wants to see those kind of films. But it was such a well-crafted film, and I almost felt like it was a science fiction film. So we aggressively went after it, and we got the film. After that, I learned they had shown the film to everybody else, and
they turned it down.
They turned it down because they didn't get it, or it hadn't shown in Sundance. So pre-Sundance, a lot of people had seen it and not. And I just saw the film, and we've sold that film to virtually everywhere in the world, and it's worked in so many countries, and still working. And it's a great film, and we hope to be involved with Deborah Granick, the director, on her next film.
That's a huge success. It was a huge success in England as well.
Yeah.
Bizarrely.
England, Australia, Scandinavia was huge. It did almost $2 million at the box office in Scandinavia and the Scandinavian countries. So, but the point is, if I had when we read that script, we wouldn't have predicted that it would have done that kind of business and sold to that many countries. And other films, we read the script and said, this is great, we have to have this film, it's going to sell everywhere. It sells nowhere. So that's why you have to have this diverse grouping of films,
Yeah.
because you just don't know anymore.
And what about the future of the business? You know, DVD is
Retirement. No.
DVD
That's a joke.
is on a slow decline,
Right.
and you know we don't quite know what the next step is, as you said earlier about VOD.
Yeah.
You know, are you optimistic about the future of independent film?
Well, if I wasn't, we probably wouldn't be sitting on this stage, right? And we wouldn't be
Yeah.
publishing that 20-year anniversary book. It's a different kind of business. It's become more complex. But I think those new technologies have a lot of promise, but it's not quite. I think they have a lot of promise, but there are still a lot of issues. You know, if you think about it, when you have 100,000 movies, it's like if you have 100,000 movies in a book or on a navigation site. How does somebody really get to your film? You know, at the end of the day, people take the path of least resistance. You know, you live in Toronto or whatever city you live in, there are thousands of restaurants, and yet you probably go to the same 20 or 30 restaurants consistently. You don't go out and really say, I'm going to try a new restaurant tonight, I'm going to take this new road. So I think the biggest problem with those kind of systems is how do you help people get to those films? Because marketing is no longer part of the process, right? It's not like movies that are marketed. You open the newspaper, you see ads, you go on the street, you see bus stops, or you go to a video store, you see the video jackets. Here, it's a listing of, films by Wong Kar-wai or films about Albania or whatever, and it's a listing. And maybe there's a little bit of art, or maybe there's social networking where it's, a community that says, okay, these are your friends and your friends watch these films. I don't think all of that's been resolved. So we're hoping for big things because our kind of films, what we'll call niche films, there's a community. So, and it's a subgroup of a bigger group. And if we can figure out how to package and promote, and maybe we can access more people than ever before. So one of the problems when you have art house films is if there's one cinema in a town, and then the next province doesn't have a cinema that plays art house films, those people don't have access to that movie. But with internet, hopefully, if people can find the movie, they'll watch it. Time for questions. Running out of time.
One more question before we ask
Okay.
some questions. From your point of view, living in Hong Kong, and from my point of view, reading about it all the time, China is exploding as a film-going nation, and it's getting better screened, and they're making bigger local films. The region is almost becoming self-sufficient and doesn't need the rest of the world. It doesn't need Hollywood movies because it has its own blockbuster movies. Do you feel that it's the next film hub?
Well, I think that there will be more and more hubs. So maybe Hollywood. Maybe before you had one hub and a lot of spokes, and maybe in the future Hollywood will be a slightly smaller hub, but then there'll be a Chinese hub and an Indian hub.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure because I think Hollywood, the storytelling approach of Hollywood and the resources and the technology still is not equaled in a lot of other places. And if you look again, we handle a lot of Japanese cinema. The way Japanese cinema is very idiosyncratic, and the storytelling is very specific. And so it's hard for some of those films to become universal successes because people just don't know how to access the stories. And I think with Chinese, what's kind of happened now in the last few years in China is a lot of filmmakers have recognized that the domestic Chinese market is so big, the potential is so huge, that they're no longer really focusing on the international market. So you have a lot of films which are being made in China and released in China and are huge successes in China, but when we look at them or other sales companies look at them, you just don't know how to bring them out of China and have them be relatable to other people.
Yeah.
So some of the filmmakers that we work with have gone Beijing. So some of the Chinese filmmakers who used to make international films really are focusing on the domestic Chinese market. But then I think there's a new wave coming again that are looking toward either the international market or trying to find a way to make films that have greater resonance.
Questions for Michael?
And not from anybody who works with me or.
Hi, Michael. My name's Adam.
Adam.
You just said that there's a sort of idiosyncratic Japanese style of filmmaking. At the panel at noon, which was on China, Focus on China, someone suggested that there was a Chinese style of storytelling, but they didn't really elaborate. Would you say there's a different Chinese approach to storytelling, and what would the differences be?
I think that's a filmmaking style in transition. I mean, you have Chinese audiences really are focused on Hollywood cinema. I mean, in fact, although you have this quota system and 20 movies a year, 20 big movies a year are allowed in, and then another 30 or 40 movies come in a different way, there's so many movies available in China on the internet and on video, illegal video, that I think Chinese moviegoers are amongst the most educated moviegoers in the world. So I think if you look at like those kids coming out of the Beijing Film Academy, until about 10 years ago, most of the teachers were Russian educated and had a kind of a more classical film education. And now everybody coming through is very much focused on making entertainment films and less and less about message films. And so I think that language is changing. It's almost made the transition. But one of the things about China is because of censorship, a lot of times filmmakers want to say things, but they have to say it in this very opaque way. So that's still kind of a restriction on creativity. And
Hi, my name is Susan Chang, and I make documentaries. And my question is, do you ever get involved with documentaries before they're finished?
that's a good question, and the answer is we did in the past. A lot of tears, and we don't do it anymore. Unless it's somebody we worked with before and we really understand what they're doing. Because the thing about documentaries as opposed to fiction films is you can't tell this. For us, a great documentary, a theatrical documentary, we like to call them they're non-fiction feature films, right? As opposed to documentaries. So you watch them, and it's almost like this is stranger than truth. And so there's a beginning, middle, and an end. There's kind of a story perspective. And you can't, when somebody describes a documentary, you can't necessarily get the storytelling ability that's going to come out. You can see what it's all about. They can tell you, we're going to interview these people, or we're going to go to these places, and this is what I want to say. But you don't really know the storytelling ability. And it's the same thing also, it's interesting, for people who are transitioning from being documentary filmmakers to being feature filmmakers, a lot of times that first or second feature film, very dangerous, because the reference point in the storytelling is documentary style storytelling, and when you apply it sometimes to a fiction film, it doesn't quite gel. But I mean, eventually you get it if if you have that talent. And
What were the tears that came out of your experiencing?
our tears, because we put money into a production, and then it just when we finally saw the film, interesting subject, but the execution wasn't what we were expecting, and therefore the sales were significantly less than we thought.
Hi, I'm Siggy. I want to know about storytelling and how basic film is how technology is really, really affecting the whole thing, because I was brought up in the basic storytelling and all this kind of stuff, and how I was trained that way, and I just feel technology is kind of losing the story, losing the basics. That's how I feel. Thank you.
You can have a conversation with my dad. I'll go home and he'll say, "Son, you're in the film business. How come you can't fix this?" So I'm in a very narrow area of the business. He'll say, they just don't make movies like they used to. The stories aren't as interesting, or So that's my dad. And a lot of people I think feel that way. But that's an interesting point, because you have some countries, like in China, there's so much money now that a lot of times stories get lost in the technology. The toys overtake the storytelling and the how to make a good film. So sometimes it's better to have less tools and less toys, and
Sherry Souls. I was at a forum the other day. You commented today that you are going to be very reserved in giving up rights or selling rights for new technology, new media, online and mobile, whatever, because we've yet to find a way to evaluate it, to to know what it's going to be worth in the future.
Right.
We were at a forum yesterday, I believe, with Stuart Ford, I Am Global, and his perspective was is that he wouldn't buy, or as a filmmaker, I couldn't sell my property without selling those rights as well. So I don't know, as a filmmaker, how you reserve those rights and also allow an agent then to exploit those rights at some point.
So he was saying that he would counsel you not to sell those rights, or?
No, that he wouldn't buy a property without those rights.
Right, that's
because
correct.
they also don't know what it's going to be worth, and
Correct.
it could be significant for them.
Right. No, I mean, the problem for us is, for example, if we acquire film, and then we go to a distributor in the UK or Germany, and we ask them to put up a significant amount of license fee, say for argument's sake, $1 million for the UK. Doesn't happen very often for our kind of films, but sometimes. If you then say, well, but you don't have, I'm giving you these rights, the theatrical rights, which giving you the video rights, but I'm not going to give you the internet rights, which, again, nobody knows how to value. And that distributor will say, well, it's too dangerous for me to take that film on, or to pay that kind of license fee, or to spend that kind of money releasing the film. Because what if 3 years from now, that particular media, that particular right becomes the most valuable right, and you've sold it to somebody else, and they then start to exploit it, and it completely eliminates my opportunity to exploit or generate further revenue from the rights that I have. So it's, almost every sales agent will insist to have all rights, what's the contract say, known, now known, or yet to be invented. Kind of a very broad thing.
Hi, my name's Kathy Prosser. You mentioned that Winter's Bone sold in many more countries than you expected it to, and yet it's overt sort of Americana. In a sense, it was a very regional story. What do you attribute to the success of that film, and do you think it applies to other sort of more regional countries' filmmaking storylines? Because typically in the past, it's always seemed as though things that were overtly regional appealed to their region, but didn't necessarily reach a broader market.
Yeah. Well, that, again, a very good question. In fact, even after we acquired Winter's Bone, and people could see the quality of the film, it's a wonderfully crafted film, and the acting, again, the directing is is really great, and the acting of pretty much all the actors that Deborah cast is really fantastic. Even after we had acquired the film and were able to show it to buyers and say we represented the film, the sales didn't come, actually. They came, we made some sales early, and then when it was released in North America and became quite a huge independent success, where it did close to $7 million box office, we then were able to make more sales. And then when some of the first international territories were released, and international buyers could say, oh, it's not just an American success or North American success, it's also has the potential to be an international success, we sold more territories. And then when it started to get all these nominations at the end of the year, that's when we sold the final group of territories. We didn't sell Japan, for example, until very, very late. And I actually had to go to Japan with a print and set up a couple screenings, and that's when we sold Japan. So that, again, it was not necessarily a sure bet, even well into the process. We really had to work it.
$7 million pre-Oscar nomination?
Yeah, that was the theatrical box office in North America.
And at that time, there were no known stars. Correct?
No stars of great significance at that point, yeah.
So sorry, here's a tough question. How do you think that happened?
No, well, I think the domestic distributor, which was a company called Roadside Attractions, did a fantastic job releasing it in North America, or in America. I don't know who their Canadian sub-distributor was, but they did a great job, and that helped us. We actually cooperated with them. We shared artwork, we shared trailers, and sometimes I think the picture was embraced by critics, and then and it played for a long time. So it's one of those films that had as opposed to like multiplex kind of releasing where you maybe play for 3 or 4 weeks, and then that's 90% of your box office. This film played for 12, 15 weeks, really continued to play for a long time into the summer.
One last question, thanks.
You've chatted a little bit about China. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the Indian film industry and its impact on shaping the industry, and if your company will be going into India and doing any deals in the future.
Well, I mean, as you know, as I said earlier, we announced today that we acquired this film called Michael, my name, from Viacom Studio 18. So that's a major Indian player. We have quite a. 2 years ago, we had a picture here called Road Movie, which was kind of a success, and we have Deepa Mehta's Bollywood, Hollywood. So we're in Indian cinema. We're just not as familiar with it as we are with Chinese cinema, and I think the development of Indian cinema has been different. But we're on. I think we're going to probably announce that we're involved with 3 or 4 additional films from India in the near future. So I wanted to say also that, you know, one of the regions that we're becoming more and more heavily involved in is cinema from the Middle East. And we announced that we're working with this very major conglomerate from Abu Dhabi called Image Nation. And Image Nation is owned by the Abu Dhabi Media Corporation, which is a government subsidiary. And that company has invested heavily in films from Nat Geo, National Geographic, Participant. So if you go see Contagion, you'll see the name of Image Nation. That's one of their investments. But they haven't invested anything in us, but we're handling the films that they produce locally that are in local language. So we have a film called Sea Shadow that we're setting up in a festival in the near future. And they financed a very interesting horror film called Jinn. Jinn means genie, D-J-I-N-N. That's directed by Toby Hooper, who did Poltergeist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So look forward to that. That's going to be a very scary horror film with genies and all kind of interesting special effects. Should be coming out early next year. Jinn. Oh, Image Nation. Yeah.
Michael, thank you very much for all your insights today.
Yeah, thank you.